welcome Duncan McDowell, Program Manager, who I presume is going to be introducing our speaker tonight, William Galbraith.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome both to you in the room and those out in Zoom land to our October lecture. My pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, William Bill Galbraith, and his topic. Now, in the years since Confederation, we've had 30 Governor Generals in Canada. In the early years, they were mainly imperial appointments, ex-military types, supernumerary aristocrats, former politicians. In our lifetime, since the 1950s, of course, our Governor Generals have all been Canadians. We've had a great variety, mainly retired politicians, but journalists and even an astronaut. But I'd like to suggest, at least my personal view, is that one of the most interesting of our Governor Generals was our 15th, John Buchan, who was in Rideau Hall from 1935 until his death in 1940. Interesting because he was a real polymath. You can't put one label on him. Yes, he was a politician active in the First World War, but as many of you will know, he was a prolific writer, the author of 30 novels, and titles such as The 39 Steps, Green Mantle, and Prester John will probably come to you either from your reading or movie viewing. He really was a remarkable man, and we're going to hear something of his career and his impact on Canada. And for those of us in Kingston, there is a more local impact in that Queen's University holds a large body of John Buchan papers, and his library, after he died in Ottawa, came to Queen's to its special rare books collection. So I think he's a very intriguing person, and I look forward to hearing more about it. Now, our speaker, Bill Galbraith, is a biographer of John Buchan, and he views Buchan as a model Governor General. Bill was educated at Carleton University and then did a degree at the Université Libre in Brussels. He had a long and I think fairly distinguished career working in Ottawa in policy-oriented jobs. First at the Conference Board, where he and I actually worked together. That's probably what makes it distinguished, I guess. I don't know. Then he went on and worked in the federal government in various aspects of national security, retiring in 2018 as the executive director of the Office of the Commissioner of Security Communications. Like John Buchan, he's a man who wears a number of hats, one of which is his proud Scottish heritage, something also that echoes into Kingston, and also as an avid admirer of John Buchan. He's on the council of the Buchan Society, goes each March, I'm told, to Scotland for the annual meeting of the Buchan Society. So we're welcoming him here because he brings a great authority about this Governor General. So Bill, please come and tell us more about him.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And I'm delighted to be here in Kingston. And as Duncan said, it was one of the delights was when I contacted the Kingston Historical Society. The other end of the communication was Duncan, and we hadn't been in contact since we left the conference board. So it was a wonderful reuniting, reconnecting, which is wonderful. And I'd like to introduce my wife, Kate, who is here with me. She's a mainstay and has been very tolerant and patient through all my decades, not just months or weeks or years, but decades of research. And when I would disappear in what our daughter called Dad's Buchan bubble, there really wasn't much point in talking to him because my mind was on my research and what I was doing. And it is significant to be talking about John Buchan in Kingston because of the connections that Duncan has indicated already. And I often start my talks with a question, and I think, and Duncan will have primed you for it, but before hearing about this particular event, how many of you had heard of John Buchan? Well, how can I say this, is perhaps an indicator of a more mature audience. A younger cohort wouldn't be quite as familiar. But as Duncan said, John Buchan was, of course, author of the 39 Steps. And it's a classic of the spy thriller genre. The Guardian newspaper in Britain in 2015 composed a list of 100 best novels in English. And they placed the 39 Steps 42nd on that list. But Buchan wrote so many more novels, as Duncan indicated. In fact, over 100 books. Other fiction, spy thrillers, yes, and fiction, but also history, serious historical biographies, poetry, short stories. And he also wrote innumerable articles and commentaries on subjects of import of the day in various newspapers and magazines. Alfred Hitchcock made a movie based on the 39 Steps in 1935, and there were subsequent film editions of it. So it's not surprising that Buchan is remembered mainly as a writer and as the author of the 39 Steps. But my focus isn't on John Buchan, the writer. It is on John Buchan as Lord Twigsmuir, Governor General of Canada. And what I'd like to do this evening is to give you some background. Duncan described John Buchan as a polymath. Indeed, he was. And I'll try to give you some idea of how that translates, that polymath translates into so many different careers and experiences from this individual. And then I'll cover his activities as Governor General here in Canada. And I'll do that according to 4 broad themes that a Governor General can be active in. And I'll describe that when we get to that part of it. But first, it's important to set the stage. Canada in the 1930s. The country is suffering from the Great Depression. The prairies are suffering from the devastating drought. And the combination of those 2 factors contributed to financial difficulties for the provinces. And that created political problems between the provincial and the Dominion government. But there was also another element, and that was the 1931 Statute of Westminster, passed by the British Parliament, which effectively gave the Dominions like Canada equality of constitutional status with Britain. It also gave legal effect to a number of decisions made by previous imperial conferences. The Dominions would now be responsible for their own external affairs, their own foreign policy. And the Governor General would no longer represent the British government, but would represent only the monarch. And it would be the Dominion governments, the Dominion Prime Minister, who would forward a name to the monarch to appoint as Governor General in that Dominion. So let's move on to John Buchan. And who was this man? He was born in 1875 in Perth, Scotland. He was a son of the manse. His father, the Reverend John Buchan, was a minister in the Free Church of Scotland. His mother, Helen Masterton, was the daughter of a sheep farming family around Broughton in the Borders region of southern Scotland, south of Edinburgh. And it was in the Borders area and around Peebles that Buchan spent his youthful summers at his grandparents', and where he tramped through the hills, speaking with shepherds and hearing their tales, and fishing in the River Tweed. And he became an incurable fisherman all his life. Canada was well positioned to indulge him in that pastime. He attended Glasgow and Oxford universities. And to get an idea of how early on his talents were revealed, we go to Glasgow University. And this young student, John Buchan, about 17 years old, asks his professor of Greek, Gilbert Murray, with a question, has a question for him. Well, that was normal enough, but the question really wasn't that normal. This young student wanted to know why Francis Bacon, the Renaissance English philosopher and statesman, had quoted the Greek philosopher Democritus in Latin. Where had such a question come from? Well, this young student was editing a book of Francis Bacon's essays for a London publisher. And Gilbert Murray recognized that such a student was obviously a treasure, and the two remained friends the rest of their lives. At Oxford, he studied classics, continued writing novels and short stories. After graduating, he moved to London and worked at a solicitor's office. He was called to the bar in 1901, and he specialized in commercial law. And there he published one of his lesser-known works, The Law of Taxation of Foreign Income. Wasn't exactly a thriller, and I'm glad that he didn't pursue that line any further. From September 1901 to July 1903, he was one of several private secretaries to Lord Milner in Cape Town, South Africa. They were working on the reconstruction toward the end of and after the Boer War. And it was in South Africa that he met troops from the Dominions, including Canada, and learned of their great pride in their young dominions that would serve him well as a base all through the rest of his life. He returned to London, the law and journalism, including as assistant editor of the Spectator magazine. And it was in London that he met Susan Grosvenor. She was 7 years younger than him and from an aristocratic family, a cousin of the Duke of Westminster. They married in 1907 and would have 4 children, the oldest Alice and 3 sons, Johnny, William, and Alistair. And Alistair would marry a woman from Ottawa, Hope Gilmore. Ursula Buchan, in her 2019 full biography of her grandfather, described Susan as quiet, but serious and a voracious reader. I guess that would be a good thing if she's marrying a writer. And that same year, 1907, Buchan accepts an invitation to become literary advisor to the firm of Thomas Nelson and Sons publishers, where his old Oxford friend, Tommy Nelson, was in the family business. Now we'll fast forward to 1914. And when the First World War erupted, Buchan was rejected for military service because of health matters, diagnosed as a duodenal ulcer, which had developed a few years earlier and which would plague him the rest of his life. But he began to write a contemporary history of the war, just with a lag of just a few months after events, and it helped to keep Nelson's viable during the war. And this writing brought him to the attention of the Times newspaper, and he became their correspondent, covering battles at the front in the spring and fall of 1915. That year, 1915, the 39 Steps was published in book form. That's almost 110 years, and it's never been out of print since. And that year, Nelson's History of the War, he published 8 volumes of about more or less 200 pages each. 8 volumes of that. Incredible productivity. And now the military took an interest in his writing and his abilities, and he was commissioned a lieutenant in the Intelligence Corps and served at General Haig's headquarters in France. In 1916, he published another novel, Green Mantle. Duncan made reference to it. It had the same principal character as in the 39 Steps, Richard Hannay. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and returned to London, where he headed up an information department reporting directly to the War Cabinet. That was February 1917, when his duodenal ulcer was operated on at his house in London. Very different practices in those days, but they did what they had to, I expect. A year later, in February 1918, He was appointed head of intelligence within a newly created Ministry of Information. And Buchan was reporting to the new Minister of Information, Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian, of course, Max Aitken, who sat in the War Cabinet. But all the while, he continued to write Nelson's history of the war. 24 volumes in total, finishing in 1919. It was a major feat, and about which that other chronicler, but also practitioner of war, Winston Churchill, wrote to Buchan in 1927, when Churchill was writing his own history of the First War. And Churchill wrote, "No one knows more about the subject than you, and your history will remain the immediate contemporary record for this country. How at that early moment, with so much still hidden, you could have massed such a vast store of fact or taken such broad, just views has always amazed me. A not inconsiderable compliment coming from someone like Churchill." After the war, 1919, a meeting occurred in London that was to have great significance for king and country. The country is Canada, but the king is our own Mackenzie King. And it was a chance meeting between Mackenzie King and John and Susan Buchan through a common friend, Violet Markham. She had first met Mackenzie King in 1905 in Ottawa, and she shared King's concerns about social issues and about the impact of industrialization on society. Mackenzie King had published a book entitled Industry and Humanity. And that meeting, Mackenzie King became quite attracted to Buchan's character and his delightful English manner, he wrote in his diary, notwithstanding that Buchan was Scottish, but that would later on just serve to endear him even more to Mackenzie King with his own Scottish heritage. Later in 1919, Mackenzie King became leader of the Liberal Party, and 2 years later, 1921, the Liberals are elected and Mackenzie King becomes Prime Minister. And 5 years later, 1924, John and Susan Buchan are traveling to North America, and they're guests of Mackenzie King in Ottawa and at King's estate in the Gatineau Hills. Buchan was en route to the United States, where he had meetings in his role as deputy chairman of Reuters, the news agency. That visit in 1924 then cemented King's intellectual and spiritual attraction to John Buchan, to the point where it all but guaranteed that Buchan's name was firmly in King's mind when a successor to Governor General Lord Bessborough had to be considered in the fall of 1934. In the meantime, however, 1927, John Buchan was elected as a member of Parliament representing 4 Scottish universities. It was a unique constituency that no longer exists, but Oxford and Cambridge also had their own members of Parliament representing them. So by the fall of 1934, Canada has to find a successor to Lord Bessborough. And as I mentioned, it was now the responsibility of the Dominion to forward a name to the monarch. Mackenzie King, of course, pushed Buchan's name because King is now leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition, the Liberals having lost an election in 1930. Richard Bennett and his Conservatives formed the government. By 1934, the Conservative government was very unpopular because of the conditions and the impact of the Great Depression. And Bennett was politically unpopular, but he was also seriously ill and very vulnerable. He would have known John Buchan, of course, and known him as a respected individual. So he accepted King's suggestion and forwarded John Buchan's name to King George V. And the official announcement was made on the 27th of March, 1935. But it created a nationwide controversy in Canada. Why? Well, the appointment was of Mr. John Buchan, and that was a break with the tradition of appointing peers from the House of Lords in London. And it raised questions in this country about who should be Governor General. Should he, there was no question of a she in those days, should he always have to be a peer from the House of Lords? And if he was going to be a commoner like John Buchan, then why couldn't that commoner be Canadian born? And it was indicative of where Canada was headed and to the eventual appointment of a Canadian born Governor General, which was 1952, and Vincent Massey being the individual. However, King George V wanted to be represented by a peer. So 2 months after the announcement, he raised John Buchan to the peerage as a baron. And Buchan took Tweedsmuir as his title name to reflect his Scottish roots. So he becomes first Baron Tweedsmuir of Elsfield, and Elsfield was his home near Oxford. The new viceregal couple arrived in Quebec City on November 2nd, 1935, where he was sworn in the Quebec legislature. They arrived in Ottawa 2 days later, and the Ottawa Evening Citizen reporter cleverly captured a dual arrival. He wrote, "Lord Tweedsmuir was warmly welcomed by a great crowd of the Ottawa people who came to the station to see John Buchan." A brilliant formulation. It was clear that here was a very different Governor General. Retired General Roger Rowley, then a young boy living in Sandy Hill and who became friends with a couple of the Buchan sons, recalled that they felt they knew him through his books and that they could feel closer to him than they ever could have to any of his other predecessors. Now, I mentioned there were 4 broad themes within which a Governor General can act. And this particular slide, we see on the right-hand side the official, the more formal roles of a Governor General. John Buchan understood clearly his constitutional role, the Crown and Parliament, as a statesman in Canada. That's one part. And the other part was that there was a role for him as statesman beyond Canada's borders. And on the left is what we could describe more as the informal or the casual roles of a Governor General, reaching out to Canadians, getting to know the country, and the country to get to know him, and in the process, promoting unity. And also another element in that more casual was the promoting excellence, a Governor General, and recognizing individuals who were contributing to their communities and to Canada and making them a better place. So let's start with statesmen in Canada and the first business meetings between the Prime Minister and the new Governor General. Well, despite Mackenzie King's high, dreamy expectations of working with this literary individual and highly respected, those first meetings didn't go so well at all. To the point, in fact, where Mackenzie King began to think that he had made a mistake in wanting Buchan. And it didn't help that he forgot Mackenzie King's birthday in December. It's just one of the areas of sensitivity of who could be a quirky Prime Minister. Contrite, the new Governor General made amends with some friendly advice from some advisors around Mackenzie King. And one of the more substantive ways that he did so was to act on what he heard about Mackenzie King's heavy workload and its adverse impact on his health. It was Buchan's breadth of knowledge and experience in business and in politics as a member of Parliament, a student of politics. He was a confidant of British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. This all goes back to reflect on on Duncan describing Buchan as a polymath. And all of that allowed him to see what Mackenzie King's operation and activities were about, and to suggest a way perhaps that he could lighten his workload. and organize his office better. But he also told Mackenzie King he wanted to free up some time of the prime minister so that the two of them could talk about things that concern our peace. And that's an allusion to the deteriorating situation in Europe and the rise of the dictators, of course. And to shorten this story and Tweedsmuir's role in it, the result was that he played a substantive and catalytic role in the embryonic stage of a modern part of Canada's modern machinery of government, helping to define what we're familiar with now as the Prime Minister's Office, the PMO, and the Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to the Cabinet. But the Statute of Westminster, that Buchan had a profound appreciation for its origins and why the Dominions had demanded more autonomy from Britain. And one of the ways that he wanted to work was to make the Statute of Westminster come alive. So he played key roles in initiating and securing the royal visit to Canada of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in May and June 1939. The King of Canada would be coming home. The images on the stamps and coins would come alive. And the King would also sit in Parliament and personally grant royal assent to bills passed by Parliament. But that visit also raised the depression-struck country's morale and boosted national unity. And those were very valuable gifts when the country would be at war 3 months later. After the war started, Tweedsmuir also played a significant role as interpreter of Britain and Canada to each other, helping to secure a British agreement at the end of negotiations in Ottawa to establish the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan that would be based in Canada, and for which Prime Minister King explicitly thanked Buchan for his role in successfully concluding that agreement. Let me turn to statesmen beyond Canada and Britain. And there was a contrast in expectations on the appointment of John Buchan. In Canada, the expectation was focused around his reputation as a writer, that he might come to Canada and help develop literature in Canada, encourage Canadian writers, which he did individually and collectively. In the United States, however, there was a very different focus. The New York Times, for example, commented how fortunate the appointment was for their country, describing Buchan's hopeless prejudice toward the United States, and that he would be the best bridge between the two continents. But the most significant activity that he undertook in this role was his relationship with American President Franklin Roosevelt. It's important to keep in mind the context here as well. The threat from the dictators was a major concern. Tweedsmuir and others realized that Britain and France would need the assistance of the United States at some point again, as America had come to their aid in the First World War. And the president had to be very circumspect in any direct dealings with Britain because of strong isolationist opinion in the United States that believed that it was British propaganda that dragged America into the First World War. It was much less risky politically for Roosevelt to be dealing with the Governor General in America's northern neighbor. And shortly after Tweedsmuir's arrival in Canada, correspondence and planning began for a meeting between the two men. They met in Quebec City at the end of July 1936, the summer residence of the Governor General in the historic Citadel. The Prime Minister was there, of course, but the location signaled that this was more a visit to the Governor General, and that's what Roosevelt wanted. It was a huge success. The speeches were broadcast over radio, including to Britain, highlighting the friendship between Canada as part of the British Commonwealth and the United States. The New York Times wrote that Roosevelt's visit to Canada must do this present world much more good than any meeting of the Assembly of the League of Nations. And it was exactly the type of outcome that the two men desired, and plans were started for an official return visit by the Governor General to Washington. But later that year, in November,
Hey, that's an interesting picture, because FDR couldn't walk. So
That's
it's
correct.
posed in such a way that it's normal. And natural. He's actually being supported by the gentleman to the left.
that's right. And that's his son James.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And that's how they gave the impression that he wasn't as invalid as he actually was. Yeah.
Probably
observation.
in a state to get that shot.
Yes, and there is a huge story behind that, and I could describe that at the end. But while we're on this slide, what really delights me in this particular photo is that Mackenzie King, he's the observer between the interaction of Tweedsmuir and Roosevelt. But Mackenzie King has such a natural smile, and you don't see that very often in photographs of Mackenzie King. Anyway, it's wonderful. Thank you for the interjection. So November 1936, and Tweedsmuir travels here to Kingston to receive an honorary doctorate of laws from Queen's University on November the 7th. And in his address, he exhorted students just entering their careers to make it their duty as honest and public-spirited individuals to endeavor patiently and resolutely to bring the world back to a saner mood and a wiser temper. We are living in a confused and difficult world, he said. Sounds rather familiar for us, doesn't it? And in such times, the human mind is predisposed to hasty conclusions. Patience, reasonableness, what we call common sense, are apt to seem counsels of despair. The moderate man, he said, is at a discount, so the Governor General ventured to speak a few words on his behalf. Now, I have a short video of Tweedsmuir in Kingston here.
Lord Tweedsmuir, Governor General of Canada, is welcomed at historic Queen's University, where he is to receive an honorary degree of Doctor of Laws. From Kingston Hall, His Excellency goes to inspect the Guard of Honor. Many old grads are back for the alumni celebration, and now the procession moves to Grant Hall for the convocation ceremonies. A brilliant writer and historian, Canada's Scottish-educated executive is quite at home in his new regalia. Prior to the football game, His Excellency poses first with Queen's Principal R.C. Wallace and then with Chancellor James A. Richardson. Here's the freshman rush for seats. The class has also made Lord Tweedsmuir honorary freshman #1, but right now they want to see that ball game. The Governor General is a keen follower of sports, and the match between Queen's and the University of Toronto promises action. Here's the kick, and the game is on.
Well, you'll never know how that game ended unless you attended. Well, we're back to the visits and the planned return official visit of the Governor General to Washington. And it occurred at the end of March 1937. And it was equally successful as the President's visit to Quebec City. The American newspapers, however, didn't distinguish between the role of a Governor General in Canada and the role of a Prime Minister. Mackenzie King, just 2 weeks earlier, had stopped in Washington on his way to Virginia for a holiday, and he met with the President And of course, there were reports about the visit between the president and the prime minister. Now, on the second day of Tweedsmuir's visit in Washington, President Roosevelt makes a particular arrangement, and the two of them are going to attend a press conference, very unusual for a governor general. And the president introduces Lord Tweedsmuir as an old newspaper man, which he was in a way as a journalist. But Tweedsmuir immediately noted he could not comment on public affairs since an official in his position has no politics. Not deterred, one journalist asked if the two men had yet had any personal conversations. Tweedsmuir repeated his previous comment, but then the president interjected, and he explained that because of the position of his guest, there could be no official talks. The two of them, however, could sit on a sofa and soliloquize and could not help but overhear the other. It was a brilliant way to tell the journalists what really was going on. And Roosevelt had added there was some of that had already happened and there would be more of that later. Roosevelt courted Britain the most of all the countries, and he was able to do it without direct contact by using the Governor General of Canada as a link. At the end of that visit, Roosevelt's parting words to Tweedsmuir were to the effect that he hoped the visit would show the dictators how close Britain and the United States were. 2 months later, Tweedsmuir was back in Kingston to address a luncheon of the Canadian American Conference held at Queen's University over several days. And Tweedsmuir addressed them on the 18th of June, 1937, stating that in his official capacity again, he was confined to what he described as governor generalities. But he picked up and elaborated on his theme offered to the American Congress that he had addressed 2 months earlier. On a close understanding, he said, between the British Commonwealth and the Republic of the United States depends the peace and freedom of the world. In working toward those noble ends, however, he stressed that common goals, common ideals, and thinking along the same lines were more important than a formal treaty. A year later, in May 1938, Tweedsmuir suggested to President Roosevelt that they meet, since they were both going to be in Kingston and involved in opening the international bridge over the Thousand Islands connecting Canada and the United States. That would have been mid-August. But Tweedsmuir's presence was not to be. He was not well, and his doctors advised that he needed a rest, he needed to put on some weight. So he traveled back to Britain in the early summer for medical examinations, the strict dietary regime, and complete rest at a clinic in Wales, and his time was extended by his doctors. Roosevelt wrote to Tweedsmuir saying he had missed him at both Kingston, where Roosevelt gave a speech at Queen's, and he had missed him at the dedication of the Thousand Islands Bridge. In his speech, President Roosevelt stated, "The Dominion of Canada is part of the sisterhood of the British Empire. I give you assurance," he said, "that the people of the United States will not stand idly by if domination of Canadian soil is threatened by any other empire." And that sentence received prolonged applause from his audience. In his letter to Tweedsmuir, the president wrote that he hoped the speech might have some effect, however small, in Berlin. At the end of the summer, Roosevelt wrote to Tweedsmuir again, still in Britain, inviting him and Susan to his country home in Hyde Park in October. And that's just, that slide is the procession of Roosevelt in Kingston when he was here for receiving the doctorate from Queen's. The Governor General returned to Kingston in early February 1939 to give a talk at the Royal Military College. And he spoke to the lads there about T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, of course, and his charismatic leadership. One of the 270 cadets present, W.K. Lai, recalled that Tweedsmuir wound up his talk by describing Lawrence's motorcycle visits to Elsfield, Buchan's home near Oxford, as I had mentioned. And he concluded saying, "Gentlemen, I have never been a hero worshiper, but I would gladly have followed Lawrence over the edge of the world." An RMC junior cadet, Britton Smith, who didn't attend the mess dinner, recalled others who did as being impressed that Tweedsmuir would understand his audience so well. After the war started in 1939, September, the relationship between Tweedsmuir and Roosevelt became more indirect and unofficial because of political sensitivities for Roosevelt in his officially neutral country. But contact continued between them nonetheless. Now, I mentioned earlier that Tweedsmuir knew it was important to get to know the country and the country him. He had known previous governors general. He had also written a biography of Lord Minto, 1898 to 1904, reaching out to Canadians, and it was natural for a man of his broad humanity. "Never be off the road" was a refrain heard from him, and in the first 2 years, he had traveled from sea to sea to sea, Atlantic to Pacific and to the Arctic. But there was one concern of Lady Tweedsmuir's in particular, and this caricature is from the Vancouver Sun. August 1936, Tweedsmuir is in Vancouver speaking to the Canadian Club, and they have some observations. And the fourth one at the bottom, which you can barely see, says, "Contrary to reports, looks exceedingly well and healthy. It must be our climate." But it's just an indicator that the Governor General's health was a matter on the public record. And that's what concerned Lady Tweedsmuir. And before they set out on their journey where they would end up on the West Coast, Susan insisted that her husband be subjected to examinations by well-known McGill doctor, Jonathan Meekins. He was accompanied, that was in Montreal, and he was accompanied back to Quebec City by Dr. Meekins at Susan's insistence. And the degree of his discomfort is signaled by the fact that he was prescribed morphine. Sometime later, in a letter to his wife, he noted that Dr. Meekins had found a drug other than morphine to help his digestive problem. But that first long distance journey to the West Coast took them through the prairies, and they wanted to see for themselves the state of the prairies suffering from the economic depression and the devastating drought. And what they saw touched Susan Tweedsmuir deeply, and she asked women what she could do. And many responded that they would like and needed books. So she initiated and managed what became known as the Lady Tweedsmuir Prairie Library Scheme. Rideau Hall was the hub and the sorting location. She obtained funding, and with volunteer donations from individuals and organizations, she acquired and collected about 40,000 books, which were then sent west and distributed through to rural libraries on the prairies, and some were also sent to rural areas in New Brunswick. The following year, Lord Tweedsmuir embarked on what is, in my estimation, his most spectacular journey, long term. He had recognized the force of regionalism in Canada, and he wanted to find some unifying elements. And he began to see the North as one of those elements, a great unifying factor in the future of the Dominion, he said, because it is common to both East and West, and is a natural bridge to unite the two divisions. And it was a vision that inspired a journey down the Mackenzie River on a Hudson's Bay Company steamboat, following the path of the late 18th century explorer Alexander Mackenzie. Tweedsmuir visited settlements all along the way down to a clavic at the river delta. From there, he was flown in RCAF aircraft to Great Bear Lake to visit a radium mine. Radium, of course, being used in the early days of research for the fight against cancer. He was then flown up to Copper Mine, which is now called Kugluktuk, on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. And I should note that here that there was a Canadian press reporter who accompanied him on this journey to the far north. And that allowed, he filed stories so that the population in Canada could follow the Governor General's journey, and they could read about an area that they wouldn't, a region, a defining region of the country that they wouldn't normally be exposed that much to. So he gained a lot of attraction to the north. But that journey had three impacts. First, on the inhabitants. It was a special and heartening event to see the King's representative visiting them and taking a sincere interest in their affairs and their future. Referring specifically to the health and welfare of the Indigenous populations, he wrote that, as representative of the Crown, I feel a special responsibility in this matter. A second impact was on John Buchan, the writer. The scenery, the history, the colorful characters that he met along the way stimulated his creative mind and provided an inspiration for what is, in my view, his most profound novel, and his last one, Sickheart River. But he also wrote a children's book, trying to popularize parts of Canadian history to make it more interesting than the books that were being used in the school, about which many students complained. And the third impact of this journey was on Lord Tweedsmuir, the Governor General. He had put his vision for the North into action, and he provided a report to the Prime Minister and to the Hudson's Bay Company governor. Hudson's Bay Company, of course, still playing a very significant role in the North in those days. And he addressed in his report issues about economic development, about conservation in the North, and about the role that Indigenous people could play as stewards of the environment and the health of the Indigenous peoples as well. When he returned to Edmonton, the exertions of travel had taken their toll, and he had to rest several days in bed. While he had traveled north, Susan Tweedsmuir had traveled to Vancouver and Victoria, but returned to Edmonton to rejoin her husband. And after his rest, they embarked on another adventurous journey, following another trail of Alexander Mackenzie, and that was to Tweedsmuir Park in the interior of British Columbia, which had been recently named after the Governor General. And it appealed, of course, to John Buchan's love of the outdoors and his sense of adventure. They traveled on horseback, in boats, in canoes, and then in aircraft that flew them out of the park to the coast. On that trip, 2 West Coast First Nations made him an honorary chief, as other First Nations had done elsewhere in Canada before. And Susan wrote a detailed article for National Geographic magazine for their trip through the park. And you can see about midway, Tweedsmuir Park, a Canadian pilgrimage. And it still makes good reading. But when not traveling to the extremities of the country, Tweedsmuir loved to escape Ottawa and go up into the Gatineau Hills and fish. And he found the fishing was colossal. But so was something else, especially in the spring and the summer, you might guess, the black flies. And he wrote to a friend in Britain that he cut a disreputable figure because one eye was almost completely shut from the swelling from all the bites. But he traveled through the Ottawa and Rideau valleys. On January 3rd, 1939, he officially opened a new hospital in Perth. He visited Renfrew, and I expect other towns and villages in the region. Lady Tweedsmuir also visited communities around the region. She was active in the women's institutes in Britain, and she became active and interested in their activities here in Canada as well. And I hadn't been aware that the women's institutes were established here in Canada. When she attended a WI meeting in Athens, not too far from here, in 1936. She emphasized the need to preserve the history of people, places, customs, and activities at a local level. The idea spread, and these became known as the Tweedsmuir Histories. And here are two examples, one from the Stittsville WI, the Tweedsmuir History Committee, and on the right is a scrapbook with an embroidered cover from Merrickville, where my wife Caitlin and I now reside. In early 1938, Susan Tweedsmuir traveled to Montreal to address the Montreal Hadassah, a Jewish women's group. It was an activity that her husband described as, in these times, very desirable. She was desperately touched by the Jewish meeting. Of course, by 1938, the awareness of what the Nazis were doing to the Jews was becoming only too clear. And the Governor General himself was described in one history of the Jewish experience in Canada as the most visible supporter of the Jews, at a time in Canada when there was considerable discrimination of Jews. But the Governor General's many and frequent travels and speeches prompted the Prime Minister to thank him, noting that his presence and his words of encouragement have done great good. And the last area for a Governor General is in this encouraging excellence and recognizing individuals who are contributing to their communities and to Canada. They became patrons, both Lord and Lady Tweedsmuir, of over 220 organizations, lending the cachet of the Crown to their worthy endeavors. Various awards recognize excellence in public service, military service, in sport, in the arts and literature, and in giving selflessly to others through volunteer activity. But often, the most often cited legacy of Tweedsmuir is the Governor General's Literary Awards. They were established under his authority in 1936 after discussions and agreement with Dr. Pelham Edgar, president of the Canadian Authors Association. The letter on this slide concerns a suggestion by Dr. Edgar and Tweedsmuir's reply to it, to establish a Tweedsmuir Poetry Award. Poetry became, rather than a separate award, one of the categories of the Governor General's Literary Awards. And Tweedsmuir also wanted to encourage the intellectual development of Canada, and he met with, to discuss various issues with the heads of the major universities. His objective in enhancing the intellectual life of Canada included in broadening the scope of studies, especially in the newer universities in Western Canada. And he promoted the establishment of university presses. However, in discussions with the heads of these universities, he ran into the reality of Canadian Confederation. And that, of course, is jurisdictions and provincial jurisdiction covering education. Nonetheless, there was stimulation and ideas to work with. And that slide, Dr. Wallace, Principal of Queen's, and on the right, you have Dr. Cody, the University of Toronto, Tweedsmuir in the middle, and on the left is Cordell Hull, American Secretary of State, who was visiting Canada, who had discussions with Prime Minister King and also with the Governor General during that visit, receiving an honorary doctorate. And despite the war having started in September 1939, Tweedsmuir continued to promote the cultural sovereignty of Canada. In January 1940, he invited Sam McLaughlin, president of General Motors Canada, to Rideau Hall. And his objective, he wrote to his sister in Scotland, was to encourage wealthy Canadians to support the development of a Hollywood in British Columbia. How prescient when 40 or 45 years later, Vancouver is nicknamed Hollywood North. Tweedsmuir had, through his incredible energy, despite poor health, become truly a man of the people. On the morning of February 6th, while preparing for another full day, including an official dinner for the new American ambassador to Canada, Tweedsmuir suffered a slight stroke, striking his head on the bath, resulting in concussion and unconsciousness. His Ottawa doctors called our renowned neurosurgeon, Dr. Wilder Penfield, from Montreal, who, after stabilizing his patient, decided to transport him to Montreal's Neurological Institute by special train. And there, Dr. Penfield and his team operated on the Governor General a number of times, but to no avail. John Buchan, 1st Baron Tweedsmuir, died on February 11th, 1940. The outpouring of grief, gratitude, and admiration was enormous. The loss of his leadership and inspiring confidence was felt more acutely because the country was at war. He had felt himself to be Canadian and was known and loved across the country. He connected from people of all walks of life. Officer Cadet J.C. Stewart at RMC remembered that everyone was very upset because Tweedsmuir was considered a kindly, caring man, more a man of the people than his immediate predecessors. John Buchan, Lord Tweedsmuir, established a new model for the role of Governor General in post-Statute of Westminster, Canada. He was, among his many contributions, he has left a living legacy. He was and continues to be an inspiration to his successors, at least 4 of whom have explicitly referred to their admiration of him or to his influence on them. Vincent Massey, I referred to earlier, the first Canadian-born Governor General, succeeded by General Georges Vanier, Adrian Clarkson, and David Johnston, who graciously provided a foreword for my book. Lord Tweedsmuir, John Buchan, was an individual of exceptional qualities. He arrived in Canada at an exceptional time in our constitutional history, at a difficult time in our economic and social history, and at a dangerous time in the world's history. Canada was fortunate to have him among them, and we are all better for it. Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you very much. What a life. We live in times when there is a kind of general hankering across borders for leadership and vision. And here is a man in the context of his time who provided that and left a real image in Canada. So we'd welcome any questions, both from Zoom land and from our audience here. And sir, here we are.
All right. The question is whether there, at the same time of the death of Lord Tweedsmuir, there was a death in Kingston of Norman Rogers, who was played a significant role in the early days of the war. He was a Canadian diplomat. And was there any connection, is the question, between Norman Rogers and Tweedsmuir? I can't say specifically, but what I could say is that the Governor General's office was in the East Block of Parliament Hill. And that was also where the Department of External Affairs, the nascent Department of External Affairs, was housed as well. And in a particular period after the death of King George V, there was mourning, there were no official functions, and so on. And Tweedsmuir wrote that many of the senior public servants, but politicians as well, would stop by his office. And he said he felt as though they could talk more easily to him because he was above the politics and not part of it. And it's certainly possible that Norman Rogers and others would have been among those who would stop by his office. But otherwise, apart from that, that's another point of research that we better take note of. Again, repeating the question, with Mackenzie King, Tweedsmuir's background, John Buchan's background in the First World War in intelligence, and the need for Bennett to accept Mackenzie King's suggestion of Buchan as Governor General in Canada, and whether or not there was pressure on Bennett, perhaps from Britain or from wherever, to allow John Buchan, with his intelligence experience and so on from the First World War, to be very useful in his role there as Governor General in relations with the United States. An intriguing question. Yes, it's possible. I'm not aware of it. But it is clear, I think that would not have been, there was a reality that Tweedsmuir was a back channel for Roosevelt to Britain, an unofficial one. And Roosevelt liked to use back channels, unofficial, so he didn't get any taint from the State Department. But there were Violet Markham, who you recall, who is the common point between Mackenzie King and the Buchans. In 1926, as a successor to Lord Byng as Governor General, Violet Markham had put forward the suggestion to Mackenzie King, who was Prime Minister then, to try and get Buchan to be Governor General to succeed Byng. So there you've got that whole motion, that whole current of John Buchan being in several people's mind, and certainly cemented by Mackenzie King and supported by Violet Markham, who was one of these great independent of mind and independent of means English women, who was quite a force behind the scenes as well. Anyway, very interesting. Yes. Very good. The question is, how did Buchan's papers get to Queens, in short? And there are a couple of connections. The Chancellor, I believe, is Leonard Brockington in the 1950s. And Sam McLaughlin, who we saw here, they both knew Buchan when he was here. And the 1950s changes in the government in Britain, and Lady Tweedsmuir is living alone in this massive, massive house of Elsfield, in the village of Elsfield, near Oxford. And I expect that some arrangement was made to purchase, Sam McLaughlin providing the money, and Leonard Brockington, who was a great admirer of John Buchan while he was here. And there's a little bit of a side light that I can get back to. But that's how the papers ended up here. They were purchased. Lady Tweedsmuir eventually had to move out of Elsfield. And it does seem counterintuitive that his personal library and his papers and his desk from his personal library are all held at Queen's University in the library and the archives here. It seems counterintuitive that they wouldn't have stayed in the United Kingdom. But it is quite natural, I think, when one thinks of how much Tweedsmuir gave of himself to this country, and the admiration that was felt. Leonard Brockington was working on an employment commission in Winnipeg when he met Tweedsmuir traveling west. And what struck Brockington was the extent of Tweedsmuir's knowledge about what he, Brockington, was working on, and his interest in all of it. And it's something that's stayed with Brockington his entire life. And he wrote a bit of reminiscence in a book that was published, I believe, in the 50s or 60s, John Buchan by his wife and friends. And it's a selection of chapters. Leonard Brockington has one. But these men, and Sam McLaughlin too, admired him so much. But there are also papers, Buchan papers in the National Library in Scotland as well. So there will be some sort of connection between the two libraries. But next June, the John Buchan Society, sort of in Canada and the United States, we're planning an event here in Kingston, mid-June. Next year, it's the 150th anniversary of Buchan's birth in Scotland. And so we're planning a weekend event here in Kingston. And of course, one of the highlights will be a visit to the library and his Buchan's personal library and the desk and so on. So there is, I hope that answers it to some extent. Yeah, the question is a personal question by John Buchan. Character, or what was it? No to writing a book. I had no intention of writing a book. I hadn't heard of John Buchan. That was the title of one of my presentations a few years ago. Until late 1980. Kate, my wife, in grade 7, I think, her teacher was reading segments of the 39 steps at the beginning of the day at school. So she had heard of him, and I hadn't. And I had been doing some completely unrelated research in the archives, more academically oriented. And I had stumbled across a document from the External Affairs that related to the royal visit, 1939. So I put that aside. And when I finished this other stuff, I went back to, I'm a great believer in constitutional monarchy. And I wanted to follow up this, the royal visit. And it was through that I discovered Buchan's role as Governor General and how significant his role was in initiating and securing that visit. And it was his love for this country. It was his character. He was a good man. And little anecdote, there was an editor of the John Buchan Journal about 10 years who was more on the progressive end of the scale. And we were at a Buchan weekend, a conference, and we were in a discussion about John Buchan. And she commented that, you know, I haven't been able to find anything bad about it. He was so damn good. And that's the type of character that he really was. And he was a brilliant polymath, huge intellect, capacious memory. I would love to have a memory that he had, the recall. Mackenzie King was, I'm digressing a little bit here, but Mackenzie King was so impressed when Buchan gave a speech, and he wrote his own speeches. He didn't look at his notes. And Mackenzie King would go back because he would have reviewed to approve what Buchan, the Governor General, was going to say. And Mackenzie King just said, it's remarkable. It's just word for word almost. So he was a man who loved Canada, inspired us. And when I discovered how much of an impact he had had on several of his successors, Canadian successors, as varied as one could understand Georges Vanier and Vincent Massey, Massey having known Buchan. But when you get them as varied as Adrian Clarkson and David Johnston, my goodness, there is something special there for sure.
Bill, a couple of questions. A biographer faces a number of challenges. Now, you've done a wonderful job on the legacy. You pointed out 4 areas that still echo into Canada. But on another level, a biographer itches to get inside the person, the daily rhythms of their life. How did this man become so productive? Writing, touring, consulting. How did he fit that into his life with an ulcer?
Yeah. Right, a miracle. It's carry on. It's very. I couldn't answer that, Duncan. There is, when he was working at the Spectator. Just your comment there. He was working at the Spectator as editor, and someone wrote a little poem that reflected his productivity. That by the time somebody had gone from up the stairs Buchan had already finished about 3 days worth of work. And anyway, I'll see if I can find it and send it to you. But how did that productivity come? It was a natural gift. A natural gift.
Many writers would itch to have it too.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Let me ask perhaps a little trickier question. In these woke times we live in,
Mhm.
there's a passion to go through the work and the speeches and the actions of people of bygone generations and finger something that is distasteful to us. And some years ago, Buchan was accused of anti-Semitism, mainly from stereotypes in the 39 steps. And the move was then to cancel him, as they say now. It seems to me that was extremely unjustified, both in the sense that it stepped out of our context into a context before. But if you read his books, they're full of stereotypes. The Scottish roadman in 39 Steps is a drunkard, and that's a stereotype. The Germans sort of steel teeth and are nasty, etc. I echo into the present time where we are satiated with James Bond films, full of all sorts of villains who should be canceled. But what was your response to this treatment of Buchan?
It was, and I guess I came to it, Mordecai Richler is one who accused Buchan of it as well. And so it set me to doing a lot more research. And through writing my book, there is one chapter in particular. It's Appeasement. The title is Appeasement and Remembering Joseph. And Remembering Joseph are words of Chaim Weizmann, who Buchan worked closely with in the 1920s and 30s, trying to keep alive the British government's commitment to the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And Buchan's novels, like it just seems so farfelu, seems so crazy to try and impute the attitudes or what is said by a fictional character in a novel and impute that to the author. And if that were the case, Stephen King, my goodness, should have been locked up a long time ago. But Buchan described, he addressed a Jewish gathering, a huge Jewish gathering in Britain in 1934. And he stated that a Jewish homeland is establishing a home for the Jews is a great act of justice to correct the wrongs, centuries of cruelty and wrongs done to the Jews for centuries by almost every, that has stained the reputation of almost every Gentile country.
Eloquently said.
Very. Johnny was the oldest son.
Yeah.
And William and Alistair the youngest.
Could you tell us a little bit about his sons, especially one that served with Farley Moe, just down the road here?
Right.
Sure.
Sure. One of the indicators of how strongly Buchan felt, the question, I have to repeat the question here, do I? Yes. So the question is, Buchan's oldest son, Johnny, who was referred to, or Tweedsmuir referred to by Farley Mowat. And Farley Mowat was serving in the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, was he, as well? Yeah, the Hasty Peas. So Johnny Buchan, an interesting background. He was here for quite a while. He worked for a year for the Hudson's Bay Company up in Baffin Island in 1939. And some of his experiences are worked into his father's book, Sickheart River, as well, about the Canadian far north. But both Johnny, who became second Lord Tweedsmuir, and the youngest son, Alistair, both joined the Canadian Army and served in the Canadian Army throughout the Second World War. And that's indicative of how Buchan felt himself to be Canadian. One could imagine that his successors, their sons, perhaps would have gone back and to join the British Army or something instead. But it didn't make any difference to Tweedsmuir. His sons were here and they were Canadian. The Governor General's website, I have to send a correction to them. They state that 2 of the children spent most of their lives in Canada. Well, that's not true. But they were here and served Canada as well. And there was a short period in which Johnny was commanding officer of the Hasty Peak. Yeah. The question is whether there was what might have caused friction between Mackenzie King and Tweedsmuir. The attachment to Britain, Canada trying to become more autonomous, and so on. And it's 2 strong currents in the country. The imperialists were one strong current, and the nationalists, I guess, were another one. And Tweedsmuir was trying to reconcile the 2 of them. And he wanted Canadians to be loyal to Canada. He says in a speech in Montreal in 1937, a Canadian's first loyalty should not be to Britain or the United States or any other country, but to Canada only, and to Canada's king. Now there's a whole backstory to that. The speech that Mackenzie King approved just said, and to Canada. But written in hand by Tweedsmuir, by John Buchan, is and to Canada's king, which reflects he wanted Canada to be strong. He wanted the Commonwealth to be strong in the face of the deteriorating international situation. But for the Commonwealth to be strong, the component parts would also have to be strong. And he wanted Canadians to be loyal to Canada and to Canada's king. So that role in the crown was there. So friction between Mackenzie King and Lord Tweedsmuir, I mentioned at the beginning, near the beginning of my talk, the first business meetings didn't go so well. Well, the reason they didn't go so well is because Lord Tweedsmuir sat down and made a couple of suggestions to Mackenzie King that perhaps there should be a knighthood given to Howard Ferguson, who was leaving as High Commissioner to Canada, to Britain, Canadian High Commissioner. Ferguson was the former Premier of Ontario. And well, Buchan didn't realize, and nobody had really told him, how viscerally and viciously he detested titles and medals and all these awards of chivalry. So Mackenzie King let him have it, and he stopped. But at a subsequent meeting, Tweedsmuir then thought, well, strengthening the sovereignty of Canada, Canada should have its own order of chivalry. So he proposed that. A little ahead of his time, and certainly far too ahead of his time for Mackenzie King, who then really blew up at him. And that's when Mackenzie King, he said, well, this is just horrid. Like, I've got a Tory here. And Buchan was a member of the Conservative Party in Britain, but he was independent of mind, which is why he was not cabinet material, because he could find common cause with the Red Clydesiders, the socialists in Glasgow, and so on. So that was an early lesson, and it's good that it probably happened so early on in their time. But it always left Mackenzie King niggling in the back of his mind. Gee, Willikers, is this guy? He's a journalist and he's a Tory politician, and oh goodness, he probably just can't get past thinking of Britain first. But during the abdication crisis, he confided that to his diary. he said they were discussing a lot of the, and Duncan, you've written about the abdication crisis and King Edward VIII and so on. And he writes, Mackenzie King writes, I'm glad the Governor General is traveling through Western Canada and out of town. They had been discussing, obviously, I mean, this was becoming a deep constitutional crisis. The king wanting to marry and then abdicate. But sometime later, King admitted in his diary that he was mistaken, that his thought that Buchan Tweedsmuir would consider Britain's interests ahead of Canada were wrong. And that was focused around the abdication crisis. But Mackenzie King would always have these suspicions. They were legacy suspicions about Britain and British governors general, but Tweedsmuir was very, very different. And Mackenzie King still appreciated him, but he could turn on a dime. He could turn on a dime, his attitude towards the Governor General. If he said something that fell out of line with Liberal policy, then he would let the Governor General have it. He'd call him in and dress him down. But if the Governor General said something that was helpful, well, Mackenzie King wouldn't say anything. He would just let it go.
Thank you, Bill, for an eloquent and instructive evening. In listening to what you just said, it seems to me that one of the lessons for Canadians in this is that we're blessed in our Constitution to have a separation between head of state and head of government. Maybe there were frictions, but that kind of dynamic has served us very well. And we only have to reflect on the United States, where the head of state and the head of government are the same. And certain candidates running for president right now embarrass their nation, in my mind. And we are preserved in some degree from that. So thank you for telling us about one man, a very significant man, who fulfilled that role so well, and whose presence echoes down into the presence for all of us. So on behalf of the society, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
We have Bill has brought several of his books, which are available up here, as are some of his clippings. And he's very eloquent, as we've seen, and you're welcome to come up and look at these and talk to our speaker. Once again, thank you for coming. Our next lecture is on November the 20th, here at 7 o'clock again on Wednesday, when we'll be joined by local architectural historian John Grenville, who will discuss the legacy and career of a turn of the 20th century architect and city engineer, Ernest Beckwith. Now, details of the talk and the time again are on our website, and I look forward to seeing you then. So thank you again for coming, and we'll see you in a month's time. Good night.